Thank you everybody for joining us at the External Reporting Board as we get into our first deep dive today on strategy for non-financial entities. I am Amelia Sharman, Director Climate Standards here at the XRB, and today presenting I have Jack Bissett and Stef Gray in the team, and they will introduce themselves as we go. So today, as I said, first of our deep dive sessions. This is on strategy for listed debt and equity issuers. Tomorrow we're focusing on the disclosures for financial sector entities, and then we're doing the same thing again on Thursday and Friday for our metrics and targets disclosures. So today, I'm just going to do a very brief overview of the context. If you want much more of that context, please go have a look at our launch presentation, which is the links on our website and also on the External Reporting Board's YouTube channel. There's going to be lots of time for questions. Please put them in the chat box so that everyone can see them. We will be answering them as we go at intervals throughout the presentation. If we do not get to everyone's questions, don't worry, we'll make sure we answer them on our website or directly to you if you put your name associated to your question. We also, as you know, are recording this presentation, and we will send the slides and a link to the presentation to all those who have registered for today's session. So we're going to move quickly. We really want to get through everything, but don't worry, you can always come back to it. And then, so I will now hand over to Jack. Just to remind you, this consultation period is looking at the metrics and targets and the strategy section. We did do governance and risk management in October with a feedback document in February. Both that consultation document and the feedback document are on our website. So over to you, Jack.
Thanks, Amelia. Kia ora koutou. Hi, everybody. My name's Jack Bissett. I'm a policy manager at the XRB. I'm going to take you through our proposed strategy disclosures and, as Amelia outlined, effectively a few of the key concepts and a few example disclosures. So it's really today is about not a deep dive on TCFD, but really a deep dive on what we're proposing in the consultation document and some of the key issues that arise through that. So firstly, what have we drawn on in bringing the strategy disclosures together? These are probably the two key sources, but there have been many others. So we've been looking very closely at the recommendations of the TCFD, so the implementation guidance, and then the additional supporting materials that sit below that. We've been looking at the IFRS draft prototype, which has been put together by their Technical Readiness Working Group. We've also been looking at other developments around the world. For example, EFRAG in Europe has been developing a draft climate standard. We have the T5 working group, and we also have, for example, the US Securities and Exchange Commission putting out their rules just last week. Not sure we've fully crossed that one just yet, but lots of interesting stuff in there as well. So very fast moving space, a lot to draw on, but these are the key, this is our sort of key Bible to be starting from. So this is the helicopter view of our proposed strategy section, really covering those key disclosures down there in the grey box, which are lining up relatively well there. The first three with the TCFD's strategy disclosures A, B, and C, and we're effectively proposing to expand that out to include a D, which is including the methodologies and assumptions relating to scenario analysis. And we think that's important, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail soon. And the objective that sits across the section we think is very important. So let me just pull that up in its full glory. So this is our proposed objective. And I think the main point I make with this slide is that it's broad. You know, there's a lot in the strategy section, and the word strategy can be maybe a touch deceiving in terms of how much information under the hood of that really the TCFD and these other standard setters are now looking for in terms of how's climate change impacting on you as an organization. And there's a lot of words in here, but really I think it boils down to what are you trying to achieve? You know, what's your strategy and how you're trying to achieve it, and that's your business model and how you're lining up your finances to deliver on that. So how's climate change impacting on what you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to do it, and how resilient are your plans moving forward, looking into the future? And there's really this importance of scenario analysis to better understand that and to give information to primary users about that. So we're going to work through all of those key sections now. So strategy A, B, C, and D, and then effectively there are sub disclosures that sit under that. So we're going to work through A to D now. As you see down there in that grey box, so we have some of these sub disclosures, and really a lot of this material has come from that implementation guidance and TCFD guidance and has been being drawn up into the standard by ourselves and these other standard setters, and we're looking very much to that. Some of this should be familiar from TCFD guidance, or some of the language is potentially changing where we're looking very much to align with other standard setters and global developments. So here with strategy A, we're effectively looking at risks and opportunities over the short, medium, and long term. And then this word time horizon comes up quite a bit. And we, at the moment, are proposing to be hands-off in that area and making sure that the emphasis is on entities determining what time horizon is most appropriate for them. There's a lot in TCFD guidance about what goes into those calls and judgments, and we think that that's much more appropriate than us trying to determine what time horizons might be best where. So those are the disclosures we're proposing for A, or relating to those climate-related risks and opportunities. And this is the first time adoption provision that relates to strategy A, and that is because we're getting into this territory of financial impacts. We are effectively proposing in this area that there would be no further information required on that particular disclosure early on, because for financial impacts, as we'll get into in a little bit more detail, we're keen to give entities more time to really do that well, rather than rushing to numbers that might be seen as potentially misleading, spurious accuracy, and not meaningful for primary users. So that's our first time adoption provision that's relevant to strategy A on risks and opportunities. So a little bit more, so risks and opportunities, this is how they tend to be organized, is this transition risks and opportunities, and then physical risks and opportunities, and physical risks in turn often broken down into acute and chronic as well. So this is high level snapshot of the types of information we'd expect to see, but then disclosed in a way that's specific to the actual entity in question. Here's an example, which is Zespri. They have put this on in their most recent TCFD voluntary report. Just a quick caveat, when I put some of these slides up with some examples, we're very much aware that these are examples of disclosure on climate risk and opportunity under a voluntary regime. Nobody's necessarily seen NZC as one, or how we're proposing the standard to look when they put these together. We're just hoping to effectively illustrate the types of information that we're talking about in these broad sections. So as you can see, physical risks, they have the high risk rating across effectively those top two at the top left there. Rising average temperatures may increase risks of pests, pathogens becoming established in primary growing regions, very relevant for Zespri, and a rise in minimum spring temperature may prevent consistent bud break and king flower production in primary growing regions. Over on the right hand side, the sort of high risk rating for transition is effectively short-term financial impacts of regulation, and then reduce production costs and enhance market access, acting to offset that. And the way they've organized this has obviously got the climate variable potential impact across the top, two different scenarios becoming relevant in some areas, and laid out with the risk rating as well. Opportunities, again, Zespri so have some examples here of opportunities, and these again organized into physical and transition. Physical on the left, so could be some positives coming out of these changing temperatures, including longer growing seasons, and potentially higher quality fruit, etc. And on the right hand side, consumer preference changes and carbon labeling basically emerging as potential opportunities for Zespri to take advantage of. So that's an overview effectively of what we're going to cover, and then strategy disclosure A. I'll pause now for any questions around that, and potentially the first time adoption provision that was relevant for strategy A.
And I just encourage anyone at any point you have a question, put it in the chat box. We can get to it at the most appropriate time, or we can get to it later. And as I said, we will be capturing all the questions because we're very, very keen to know what you're interested in and what you're unclear about. But I think we can probably move on, Jack, to, oh no, excellent, thank you very much. Okay, so first question, does each risk and opportunity need a disclosure over every time period? Wouldn't this create a lot of information and capture immaterial information?
Yes, good question. I mean, I think that the important overarching context for reading all of the disclosures is that materiality applies to all of them. So we effectively would see that as the filter to take out anything considered to be immaterial. So for example, if, you know, but then I guess the other thing I'd say there is that the way that the time horizon is defined should also be informed by what's material, so that if no primary user cares what's happening out in the given time horizon, then it's likely to be immaterial.
Okay, and then we have another question from Amy Hill. So re-strategy A, adoption. Could you please clarify what is meant by no further disclosure required? Does the XRB mean that for the first climate statement, there is no disclosure under 4B required?
Yeah, sure. So I think for some of our first time adoption provisions, we're still requiring some disclosure is made, so with some information, and in that case, there would be, you know, it'd be fine to leave the disclosure blank and provide nothing. And I'll get into in a moment some of the other first time adoption provisions. It's more easier information to disclose effectively along the journey to the full disclosure. For example, you know, what are you doing to get there, rather than the actual information itself.
And just to clarify for everyone as well, where an entity decides to make use of a first time adoption provision, you don't have to. Where you decide to make use of it, you must state that you are making use of that first time adoption provision. So for example, if you wanted to make use of the provision, you would just say that, yes, we are making use of this provision, therefore we are not providing any further information or any information on this disclosure. Great, I think we can move on to the next section.
Thanks, Amelia. Okay, so we'll crack on. So strategy B is the next disclosure that we'll cover. So up in the green box, we've got a description of the impact of those climate-related risks and opportunities on the entity's business model, strategy, and financial planning. So this strategy B, there's a lot in here, absolutely, and this is an important part of the standard overall. So those sub-disclosures is quite a bit coming through. Firstly, one of the things that we proposed is to actually add that first sub-disclosure, which is a description of the business model and strategy. And that is because there's so much information in here about how is climate impacting on your business model and strategy, we want to make sure primary users have got a good, clear route to understanding, well, what is the business model and strategy, full stop. And we're really expecting here a short description of information that likely is written up elsewhere, really wanting to make it easy for primary users and not expecting anything long here and wordy around what this is, but really looking for a short, punchy description. Next is those actual impacts of business model, strategy, and financial planning. And this is where there's a distinction coming through the standard now around actual and potential. So actual being backwards looking and into the current period, and potential being looking forward into the future. And that's an important distinction. So we've got impacts as well, separated out from financial impacts, where financial impacts is really the more detailed version of what impacts is, and we'll get into that in a little bit more in a moment. Next, how climate-related risks and opportunities serve as an input into financial planning. And then lastly, transition and adaptation plan aspects of the strategy. And again, I'll have a slide on that in a moment. So here again are the relevant first time adoption provisions that we're currently seeking feedback on. So we're looking at specific to those disclosures around financial impacts again, and then below the transition plan aspect of the strategy. So firstly on the actual financial impacts, yeah, as I alluded to a little bit just before in response to that question, we would expect in this case it would be qualitative information on financial impacts in the first climate statement, and then in the second climate statement onwards is where the quantitative information would start to come in. And on the transition plan, in the first climate statement, we're expecting progress to be described towards developing a transition plan, and from the second climate statement onwards, it would be disclosure of the relevant aspects of the plan. And just to cover off these adoption provisions, and so then on adaptation plans, we're providing more lead-in than transition plans. So for the first two climate statements, it would be disclosure of the progress towards developing an adaptation plan, and the third climate statement onwards, we'd be expecting disclosure of the adaptation plan aspects of the overall strategy. So a quick slide on what's the difference between impacts and financial impacts. We've tried to deal with this through definitions to try and make this clear, but effectively impacts being the higher level information than financial impacts, which really then takes, what are the effects of climate-related risks and opportunities materializing on the entity, and then turning those into more detailed information about how that's impacting financial position or performance and cash flows. So here's an example disclosure from Meridian Energy, which is one that the TCFD cited itself in its guidance on financial impacts, metrics, targets, and transition plans. And so Meridian's laid it out in this way, where you can see down towards the middle there, where they have impacts separated out from financial implications, they've called it, and then the quantification being the more quantitative version of the financial implications, so that text there being more qualitative, and all of that linking back up to the relevant risk, which is in this case physical risk, which they've looked at over the time frame of 30 years over the long term, and that's extreme rainfall and hydro catchments. So that's one example there for you. Again, we've drawn on that just as a way to help explain what we're talking about in this section. So what are transition and adaptation plans? The TCFD's really emphasised in its most recent guidance that this is information that primary users are seeing as important. They've done a survey which indicated that 96% of primary users thought that transition information on transition plans was effectively very useful or somewhat useful. And therefore, in their most recent guidance, they've really emphasised that this needs to be coming through in a way which is tied into the overall business strategy and not as separate, disconnected plans. So here's an example disclosure, which is Nestlé. Here's their transition plan, and they have information in here which goes beyond, this is not just about strictly targets to reduce emissions, but it also gets into broader changes to support the transition to a low emissions economy, such as, in that right-hand side red box, we've got things like investment in new technologies, fundamental changes to our products and businesses around the globe, and, really much more long-term considerations for how they're going to be effective out into the 2030s and the 2050s. So that's strategy B. I'll pause there. Amelia, any questions?
We do have one question from Alex Skinner, which says, will model disclosures be provided to give an idea of context/nature of disclosures? Obviously acknowledging all entities will be different. We've had this question before, and unfortunately the answer is no. We are not anticipating providing model disclosures. The reason being because we know that this is new, having this as a mandatory regime. However, there's also a heap of information available in the TCFD. The TCFD does provide templates and all sorts of things that I think could be construed as model disclosures that you can draw on. We really want entities to do this, think about it in the entity, give a disclosure, give it a go. Both the XRB and the FMA are very, very clear that we are not expecting perfection on day one for this regime. We really want to see how it evolves. We also don't want to set in stone a particular way of disclosing, which actually might not be the most suitable for investors. I mean, we're doing our very, very best to work out what we think is the most appropriate thing, but we know that we want to have an open mind and see actually how it goes over time. So that, unfortunately, the answer is no at this point. And maybe in our post-implementation review, we decide that we're going to do that, but not at the moment. We have another question that's come through in the chat, thank you, which says, what sort of checks or prerequisites the XRB would expect of companies in coming up with the quantification of financial impact, example audits, for example?
Yes, very good question. I'd say that that's a topic we haven't spent a lot of time investigating just yet, but it's certainly something that will clearly be relevant. I mean, I think the first thing that we'd say is that we're writing the standard primarily looking at the disclosure end, and we're also thinking primarily, beyond what's in scope of the legislation around assurance of emissions, and so we're focused more on that disclosure aspect, and so that would go quickly to, we're thinking about disclosures like disclosure methodologies and assumptions that have gone into financial impact calculations. We haven't actually proposed any disclosures on that, but we have been thinking in that area. So that's probably where we've spent the most time thinking, but a good question, something we can think more about.
And I think, and also an answer to that, we absolutely wouldn't expect to see something coming through in your climate statement that is incongruent with what's in your financial statements. And that is obviously something that your auditor might have a very strong interest in, especially if your disclosures are, part of your annual report. So yeah, it is something we're thinking about. We don't want to tie it down exactly yet. We just want to see a little bit more about what the expectations are and how the market evolves. But we are thinking about assurance more broadly. We've got another question here which asks, how would a company know if they have sufficiently disclosed? Feedback from investors or the second year audit? Really interesting question. Yes, both of those things. So we are very, very keen to understand what the market, and by the market I mean the primary users, the existing and potential investors, lenders and other creditors. We really want to know what the disclosures are looking like are sufficient. We're also working really closely with the FMA to make sure that there is a really good expectation around what is sufficient from a regulatory perspective. I mean, for example, if you think about the governance disclosures where we ask for a description of, how the board is talking about climate change, your disclosure might be that you're not talking about climate change, and that's your disclosure. So in that sense, you really are disclosing what you're doing. There's no necessary, achievement of a particular performance threshold. But it is an evolving area. I mean, what is best practice now is, in a year's time, rapidly looking like middle of the road. So we definitely expect this to be something that will adapt and change over time, which is probably a little uncertain, but we know we want to take account of how best practice is moving. Okay, so another question. If companies, due to lack of capability or more nefarious motivations, I love that, fail to disclose material information or misrepresent their climate risk and opportunity, what is the consequence for those companies? And I can answer that one as well. So the FMA has put out their compliance expectations in a document that came out at the end of last year. In the early days, they will be focusing on gross non-compliance, by which we may they identify, for example, as just not putting out a climate statement at all. But obviously the FMA are very, very concerned to make sure that what the disclosures are right. There are penalties in the legislation around non-compliance. Those are both criminal and financial. So we really do want to encourage entities to take this seriously, get involved, but as I said, I don't think there's going to be any massive regulatory hammer coming down on people if they're just a bit uncertain about the level of detail that they need to disclose. Right, last question, I think in this area, maybe. We'll see how we get going for time. Again, from Sebastian. Thank you, Sebastian, for your questions. I think it is extremely important that entities disclose their assumptions and methodologies for financial impacts. Otherwise, how do these numbers mean anything? Making certain assumptions, I can make a model spit out any number I see fit.
Yep, happy to answer this one. I think it's a great question. We have been looking at that, and there's also the area of methodologies and assumptions that are bound up with the transition and adaptation plans. Also not proposing that those are disclosed at the moment. Largely, we're thinking that, look, this is an ask. This is a broad section already in terms of what it's asking entities to do, and so because we're really honing in on seeing some improvements in the area of methodologies and assumptions for scenario analysis. We think that it's going to be a big ask if we try and cover the breadth of the strategy section with all of the underlying methodologies and assumptions. We don't think there's anything stopping anybody doing that. We think that we would expect a lot of entities to do it naturally anyway, just as part of good practice and as part of clearly communicating what the numbers actually say, and so we don't think we need to call it out specifically, but obviously very open to feedback on that at this point. We're trying to strike that balance between principles-based and rules-based approach.
Thanks, Jack. So that's all the questions we have now. I can see someone raised their hand, but because this is a webinar, we can't invite attendees to speak. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A or the chat. Right, so let's head on to the next section.
Let's keep on going. Okay, strategy C, we're up to. Thanks, Amelia. So this disclosure is about a description of the resilience of the entity's business model and strategy to different climate-related scenarios. And so this is where scenario analysis starts to play a really important role in the standard. And so the sub-disclosures we've got are the potential impacts on business model and strategy, how the entity's business model and strategy may change to address those, potential financial impacts on the entity in terms of position, performance, and cash flows, and then a description of the scenario analysis as undertaken, and we're effectively proposing that entities will need to use at least a 1.5 degrees and a greater than 2 degrees scenario as part of this. And so one of the things I'd say here is that it's interesting to note that the mention up the top of financial planning drops off, and so it's really instead of it being about the resilience of the financial planning, it's really about the resilience of the business model and strategy. And then the focus changes a little bit when it comes to the financial planning, where it's asking how those plans aligning with what's happening in response to climate change. And here are the relevant adoption provisions that we're proposing for strategy C, and so that's relating to the potential financial impacts, and similar to what I outlined earlier, what this is looking at in the first climate statement, disclosure of qualitative only, and then from the second climate statement onwards would be where we'd expect quantitative information to start appearing as well. So that's all from me on strategy C. I'll kick over to Stef and he'll run you through in a little bit more detail what we're proposing around scenario analysis.
Excellent. Thanks, Jack. It's always a very kind of contentious and interesting part of the process to talk about. So firstly, if we start off, what do we view scenario analysis as? Well, to us, it's a process for systematically exploring the effects of a range of plausible future events under conditions of uncertainty. The primary purpose of scenario analysis in the context of climate-related disclosure is to test the resilience of the entity's business model and strategy. In the process of doing that, climate-related risks and opportunities are typically sort of fall into the mix as well. They're identified at that stage, and that is really usefully sort of feeds into the wider disclosure process. And the proposed strategy section of NZCS1 requires entity to describe the details of the scenario analysis that they've undertaken. And we would strongly encourage you to look at our proposed definitions in doing that, because the term scenario analysis and climate-related scenarios are very important. So look out for that 2-page fact sheet that we have explaining that a bit further. And as Jack's already mentioned, the key decision that we've made on scenario analysis is that we've proposed to align with the TCFD and the TRWG by requiring that disclosure is made in relation to, at a minimum, a 1.5 degree scenario and a greater than 2 degree scenario. We'd actually encourage you to go further than that, really. 2 is a minimum, 3 would be a better mix, 4 would get you more emissions reduction pathways along the way. So the XRB has spent the last few months, you're probably well aware, loads of people on this call are well aware, that we're engaging with sectors to encourage entities to start on scenario analysis at the sectoral level. So many sectors are doing that already. Others are starting out on some collaborative projects, and we're really excited about the progress that's already being made, and we'd encourage you to stay across what's happening in your sector. There's lots underway. Now, the reason that we've encouraged sectoral scenario collaboration is because the translation of the higher level information about global patterns of change down to an individual entity level is a substantial undertaking. And sectoral collaboration can help to ensure that this translation is done in a more consistent way and more efficiently than having all of the entities do it separately and individually. So that means that we're helping series to avoid the situation on the left and move more towards the situation on the right-hand side, which we believe will also result in some more consistent disclosures, both within and across sectors. So that's not a mandatory part of the standard, but it's a really helpful way for entities to start thinking about trying to meet it. So we're working on our first piece of guidance on scenario analysis at the sector level to be released in the coming months to further support this drive for consistency and comparability.
Thanks, Steph. I think we might, we're having a few comments about challenges hearing your microphone, so I might just pass back over to Jack to complete this section. Thanks, Steph.
Cool.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this slide is effectively starting to give you a bit of a sneak peek on what Steph and I have been working on, and this is really trying to get some consistency across scenario analysis, but not necessarily prescribing what must be done, effectively trying to encourage the use of what we're calling shared architecture, so that effectively the assumptions that are made form plausible, coherent worlds, and that they're plausible and coherent from the top level, so things like IPCC, RCPs, temperature outcomes, all the way down to what's happening in this in New Zealand in terms of transition and the physical impacts of change. And so we're really hoping that through this guidance that we'll strike the balance of some increased consistency and comparability without turning it into a world where we're prescribing too much detail and everyone finds it difficult to move forward. So that's an indicative look at the way we're trying to achieve that, which is to be to lay out what we think are plausible, coherent architectures across what is the NGFS setup really, and increasing standard practice in this area, which is orderly, disorderly, hothouse, and too little, too late as the broad scenarios in question. And in terms of the work that Steph mentioned, in terms of sectors coming together and collaborating in this area, this is our high-level indicative understanding of where all of the various sectors are at. So the marine sector constructed scenarios for the purposes of TCFD type disclosure, and then into actual sector level adaptation planning as well on the back of it. They did that in 2020. The general insurance sector has been together for 2 to 3 months working on about a 6-month piece of work to develop climate related scenarios. And then there's stakeholder engagement and projects getting off the ground at the moment across tourism, banking, materials and buildings, and energy. And I think among the rest there, plenty of conversations and traction as well, but a little bit further behind. So we're keeping abreast of those conversations, very excited to see what's happening in that area as entities effectively get started on scenario analysis at the sector level. So that's all we were going to cover on scenario analysis for now, in terms of just thinking about strategy C and what's in there. One of the one of the important issues that's come up a fair bit, and we know is on quite a few reporting entities' mind, is around where are some of the boundaries around what we're looking for, particularly in strategy C, given that it's looking for some pretty detailed information on the resilience of strategy. Where's the boundaries with that confidential information? And so would encourage you to look at what the TCFD has been saying on that. They do, they've obviously been dealing with these queries for many, many years, back to 2017. And, effectively they're encouraging here to really think through about whether or not you're in this blue box here, whether the information provides the company with an economic benefit that translates into a competitive advantage because it's information that's unknown to competitors. That's an important thing to think about when thinking about disclosing anything as confidential, and also thinking about whether making such information public could cause a considerable economic loss for the company. In those cases, that's where it's not expected that disclosures would be made. And then TCFD's note at the bottom there would be, encourage you to think about disclosing more over time rather than just not disclosing at all. So that's strategy C. Any questions on that, including the aspects of scenario analysis that we covered there?
All right, we've got lots of questions, so I'll work through them. So one from Tim Grafton. Hi, Tim. The XRB is quite prescriptive regarding 1.5 degree requirement, but lurches to full flexibility when requiring a scenario over 2 degrees. In the first instance, you support comparability, whereas in the latter, you depart from that by inviting a wide number of scenarios. Wouldn't a tighter range, say 2 to 2.5 degrees, be a better balance?
Having rebooted my mic, it seems to be working now. That's a fair question, Tim. We're sort of thinking, depending on the timescales that are involved in these scenario analyses, for the most part, most of those higher end differentiations come later, out towards the 2100 end. And at this stage, we would imagine most of the analyses are going to be sort of temporarily a bit shorter than that. But I think it's an interesting and fair point to sort of throw into the mix.
Yep. I mean, I would say that, the TCFD's original recommendations was to say effectively a less than 2 degrees scenario. And, there's been this probably drawn out period where it hasn't been 1.5 on paper, even though that's been a lot of where people have been driving at. And so now we think that the direction of travel is that with the Technical Readiness Working Group, they've gone with a Paris-aligned 1.5 degree with the direction of, in this area, we think that 1.5 means that everyone can organise around that, and that's clear. And then when we think about going out to the greater than 2 degrees end of the spectrum, that's where we think there's still a lot of debate and entity-specific consideration around where is sensible to explore.
Great, thank you. So next question. Would we need to disclose for all 3 categories, financial position, performance, and cash flow? Let's take an example where we have no cash flow risk, but have big financial position risks or opportunities. Is it okay to state there is no impact on cash flow across the scenarios in this example and not disclose all categories?
Yeah, I mean, if that was the conclusion, then I think that sounds fair to me.
All right, next question. With the sector work on scenario analysis, are you able to advise the relevant umbrella bodies to liaise with for specific sectors, please? For example, which umbrella body is the XRB working with for the retail sector?
Yes, great question. I'm very happy for you to follow up with us directly on that. We've been doing a lot of work with the various umbrella organisations. I think the picture is moving quickly with various umbrella groups either picking up and playing a facilitation leadership role on some of those sectors, and a bit of to and forth between them as well about who takes what. So yeah, maybe easiest way to deal with that is follow up with us directly.
And you can just email us at climate@xrb.govt.nz, probably the easiest email address to remember. So next question is there a risk where large industrial players manipulate the scenarios to make their own business strategy look good and make it harder for market entrants to disrupt as their business model now falls under a bad case scenario?
Bit of a curly one, but I think there's a good few scientific and research and policy checks and balances on that being possible in what is a predominantly a participatory qualitative scenario development process. So there's a good sort of equality of voice around the table of those involved, and it'll be very difficult for someone to skew the results flying in the face of the science and research and policy drivers that come together to make outcomes in a scenario context.
I think, you know, this was a question that came up earlier around who is going to be driving what good quality looks like. And I think, you know, we very, very much expect to see capability, both in terms of the climate reporting entities and in terms of, you know, what the investors will be looking for and understanding rapidly increase. And so the quality checks and balances will be on both sides there. So another question, who will provide the sectoral scenarios? Are their assumptions and methods audited? The sectors obviously have their own interests at heart, so we may end up with some conflict of interests.
I can take that one. I think, just to be clear, I mean, we're not planning to provide anything other than what we would see as guidance around sensible families of assumptions that map well to different scenarios as we just work through that orderly, disorderly, hothouse type architecture. Otherwise, we think that the job that needs to be done is at a sector level, ideally, given we think it's most efficient, is to take what's out there in terms of existing information globally, domestically, regionally, on broad brush patterns of change, and then distilling that down to what does that mean for the given sector in New Zealand, bringing up a bit of the bottom-up context of that sector and what their day-to-day operating environment actually looks and feels like.
And it's all about transparency as well at sectoral level. So the intention is that this is effectively a public-facing process, and that we'd really like for the outcomes of this to become public. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for transparency to cut across any sort of malfeasance of action in there.
I'll just make two additional points. So there is no requirement for entities to participate in a sector level scenario construction process. It is not a requirement in the standard. We just think it's a really good idea because we think that it'll be more resource efficient for the entities, and we think it will promote comparability. And then the second point is around the auditing or the assurance of those assumptions and methods. The only legal requirement for assurance under the regime at present is as specified in the legislation, which is over the GHG emissions disclosures, which we specifically identify in the current consultation. Assurance may be extended over the entire standard in the future, but that is not something that it is currently part of the regime. Entities may wish to get any and all disclosures assured, and they may wish to go beyond limited, which is the minimum level of assurance that we have identified for the GHG emissions disclosures. But yeah, really, really clear that assurance requirement is only on the GHG emissions. And just another quick one, how do we find out about collaboration in our sector? Again, we've tried to contact every single climate reporting entity that we know of to talk to them about it. But yeah, if you're not sure, just email us and we can tell you more about what's going on there. Really interesting question here. When you talk about financial disclosure of potential impacts, is a wordy explanation expected, i.e. like the Meridian example that used a range, or are we expected to produce a full forecast profit and loss balance sheet and cash flow for every scenario run in the model we use to test the impact on the business model?
Yep, great question. Maybe a few upfront things. I don't think we're looking for anything to be wordy in the sense that all disclosures shouldn't have any insignificant details, so they should be as short and sweet as they need to be. I think in there was a mention of ranges that Meridian had. I mean, I think it will be given it's looking forward over quite long time horizons, you know, the further out, the broader the ranges are likely to be. Very much expecting that a lot of entities will be having ranges involved with those potential financial impacts. And then in terms of, I'm trying to recall the end of that question, but the link to scenarios, that's where, look, we think that entities may wish to tie those potential financial impacts to the scenarios that they have thought through, but that's not necessarily a must, and we haven't made any specific links there. The US SEC, for example, has made quite a lot stronger link to the scenario analysis in that area that you could have a look at as a comparison to what we're currently proposing.
Great. I think one thing, I would say just a little bit on that. So when we say wordy, qualitative, we are very much expecting that there will be probably a much more narrative focus in a climate statement than would be in traditional financial statements, possibly. We just want to make sure that the information is provided in a way that is of most use to your primary users. So that's your existing and potential investors, lenders, or other creditors. Okay, another question: where does retirement villages and aged care fit in? Materials and building, or healthcare?
Some, just to use as a bit of an example, we think some reporting entities may sensibly find the work of multiple sectors to be relevant to them, and they could draw from the different pieces of work to their liking. By the sounds of that, I would have started with healthcare personally, but you know, we obviously independent Crown entity setting standards. We don't feel like we're in the best position to be making the calls around where the sectoral boundaries are, and we've been, in the context of encouraging sector level scenario analysis, trying to organise those conversations in a useful way initially, but expecting the boundaries to move and shake over time as entities get more and more into the work.
Thanks, Jack. Next question: on confidentiality and referencing the breadth of the draft materiality definition, together with the TCFD guidance suggesting one should stray on the side of disclosure, it feels that there will be an interesting grey area in exercising judgment about what to disclose. Will there be more guidance from the XRB in this area with examples? It's a really interesting question. I think, you know, over time we will look to see what the type of information is that's coming through. You know, the FMA will also look to see, you know, what's the information coming through. Yes, I completely agree. I think it is a bit of a place where you should be exercising judgment, and market, you know, the market might expect to see more, and we would be very, you know, we'll be constantly talking to the investors, the users, you know, when we do our post-implementation review of the standard, to make sure that the information that's being disclosed is meeting investor needs. As I said, you know, we definitely think that what is best practice is a rapidly moving feast. So yeah, we will keep an open mind, but noting, you know, we are not the regulator, but we will be working with the regulator on what we expect to see. Anything else you want to comment on, Jack or Steph, from the maybe the existing disclosures that are coming out under the voluntary regime?
All I would add is just that it would be useful. I mean, we're consulting at the moment on proposed disclosures. If there are confidentiality concerns that are particular to individual disclosures compared to sort of broad brush areas, that's going to make it easier for us to consider where we go with the standard itself. And obviously, if there are areas where you really think that there's more guidance needed for you to meet what's written down as the proposed disclosures, then yeah, also keen to hear that.
Yeah, and that would apply for sectoral differentiation as well, so particularly between financial and non-financial entities, etc.
Great, thank you. And currently, our last question: in the case of scenarios voluntarily collaborating on in the case of sectors voluntarily collaborating on scenarios, if a sector provides scenario details with some beneficial assumptions, then entities can just point to that sectoral scenario work as a validation of their own scenario reporting. How is this situation avoided?
They can do that immediately. Entities can just use beneficial assumptions if they so choose, but they would need to disclose those. And then aggregating up to the sectoral level, we're hoping to get more people around that table to allow, to sort of stop those things occurring by having sufficiently broad participation in developing the scenario that having your thumbs on the scale is a little bit more difficult. But in any case, the key thing that we're trying to get from the entire regime is transparency. So if there are assumptions in there which others might see as beneficial or taking a bit of a soft soap kind of approach to it, making those clear through the disclosure process will help to shed some light on who's done a better job of finding their risks and opportunities.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we can move on.
Yeah, that's a good lead into the next and last section. So this is strategy disclosure D, which is the topic we're just talking to now. So the methodologies and assumptions underlying the scenarios used and the scenario analysis process employed. So we're effectively looking at, and this has been drawn largely from the TCFD's guidance on scenario analysis, is sub-disclosures around each scenario narrative, the various pathways used, key assumptions, sources of data, and then the governance processes used to oversee and manage the scenario analysis process, including the role of board and management, so that there's clarity about how the entity is treating scenario analysis. Has it been given to one staff member to sort out, or has the board and management been involved in the process, which is very important from the perspective of primary users, because the purpose of doing it is to test the resilience of the strategy and the business model. And so we see that as an important aspect of this section. And that's all I had on what we've got in here. But just to reiterate, we think that this is consistent with TCFD guidance. We also think if you go and have a look at the technical readiness working group's climate prototype, that this is the likely direction that they're going to go, and the US SEC as well, which is that there is concern in this area that it can be difficult to just look in and understand the results of scenario analysis. So it's really important that there's transparency around what's been assumed. So, Sebastian's effectively through his questions highlighted the issues there, which is people making overly optimistic assumptions. And we think that over time, those will become increasingly called out by primary users, because the whole purpose of these scenarios is that they need to be plausible and coherent. So if the world is going in a certain direction for everybody else and not the particular entity in question, then it's going to be quite obvious to primary users that they're really not thinking through the strategic implications of climate change in a sophisticated way.
Thanks, Jack. So we've got about 6 minutes left. If anybody has any last questions that they want to ask about strategy D, any other bit to do with strategy, or anything else on the regime, just leave it open for a minute or two, just to see if anyone wants to do a quick type in the Q&A or the chat box. Well, okay, so I think it's been great to have all your questions. Thank you very much for everyone for attending. We've got our whole series of deep dives this week, which probably lots of you have registered for. So tomorrow we're focusing on the strategy, but for financial institutions. And then on Thursday, Friday, we're doing metrics and targets in the same. So if you have any other questions, we're really keen to hear from you. We are also keen to understand if you don't have the time to do a full submission and you just want to send us an email with some thoughts, we're really keen to get those. They all help us in terms of our understanding of any concerns or challenges as we get towards the exposure draft period. Just see. All right, we've got one more question. Or 2 more questions actually, good job. From Tim, the examples you gave showed quite brief and high-level disclosure. In contrast, reading the draft standard, there is a clear sense that far more detail is required. Am I misreading this?
I think, I mean, it's fair to say that if you were to go and read the TCFD's recommendations and then all of the relevant guidance, you know, that can look quite different to then going and reading, say, Zespri's TCFD disclosure or Meridian's. So I would be thinking that our mind is not necessarily on expecting screeds more detail than some of the voluntary TCFDs, at least some of the more mature ones. But obviously we are proposing some additional transparency in some key areas, for example, the scenario analysis methodologies and assumptions, and probably a few other bits and pieces scattered through. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Steph, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think the only way we're going to get real clarity on it is through practice. Just seeing what it looks like once it's in practice and in play and people are disclosing against it, it'll naturally find its level, I think.
And we're very, very keen, this is one of the big intents of the TCFD, that this reporting is not a compliance exercise and it's not something that's done outside of your normal thinking about your strategy. So it should be integrated, it should be meaningful and succinct, I think, in terms of what you're saying, so that the primary user can really get a strong sense of what it is that you're doing. And where there needs to be additional description that makes it meaningful, that's perfectly relevant. But it is, as Steph said, it's a new regime. We're just keen to see what's happening. And then last question, we have time for the last one. Is it necessary to include sector adaptation strategies in the sector scenario analysis?
Necessary, no. Perfectly welcome, yes. But just to be clear again, none of the sector work is necessary or mandatory. It's really down to sectors to decide what it is that they'll do and how they'll do it.
Maybe just to be clear on that differentiation. So scenario analysis has been used, for example, by the marine sector as a way to explore risks and opportunities and potential implications. And then on the back of doing that piece of work, have then decided to develop a sector level adaptation plan, but that those are quite distinct pieces of work, and the scenario analysis sensibly precedes an adaptation plan because there's much more richer understanding of what it is that you're responding to.
And then over time, as entities do this process again and again, these are annual disclosures, more and more information, richer and richer information can go into those, scenario processes that can be incorporated into the type of work that you do. So we definitely expect to see a lot of different and more sophisticated information, both incorporated and then reported over time. So thank you again so much for everyone for joining us. As I said, this presentation will be made available on our website. Please contact us, have a look at the consultation documents, follow us on LinkedIn, and we'll look forward from hearing from you. Mā te wā.